On September 27, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe boarded a train in Richmond, Virginia, headed for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There he was going to meet with the poet Marguerite St. Leon Loud. What, you say you've never heard of Marguerite St. Leon Loud? Well, no one else has either. She has been lost to history for the most part. If it weren't for the fact that Edgar Allan Poe was going to meet her to help prepare a group of her poems for publication, we might never hear of her name at all. After meeting with Marguerite, he was going to New York, where he was going to deliver a lecture. Unfortunately, he never made it to that lecture. Those who were waiting to hear Edgar Allan Poe speak were disappointed. Marguerite St. Leon Loud, waiting in Philadelphia, was also disappointed. Mr. Poe never showed up. In fact, he seems to have dropped off the face of the earth, and no one had an inkling as to his whereabouts for the next 5+ days. Fast forward to a cold, rainy night, October 3rd. There is a polling station, a voting place, at Gunner's Tavern, a tavern in Baltimore, Maryland. There, a Mr. Joseph Walker, a typesetter for the Baltimore Sun, is walking to vote, when he happens across a very unpleasant-looking fellow lolling about in the gutter, shabbily dressed in clothes that would turn out not to be his own, rambling incoherently, filthy to the core, and obviously in a state of extremely poor health. Joseph Walker, unlike so many others walking by, took pity on the poor soul, went to offer some assistance. That's when he realized, much to his surprise and I would say chagrin, this was the famous poet Edgar Allan Poe. Now let's pause for just a moment and acknowledge the fact that finding a famous poet, drunk, disheveled, or in almost any state of affairs whatsoever, is not all that prodigious. In fact, the famous last words of the poet Dylan Thomas were, "I've had 18 straight whiskeys. I think that's a record." Nevertheless, Joseph Walker realized that Edgar Allan Poe seemed to be on death's door. He was in a terrible state. So Walker asked Poe if there was anyone close by that he could contact to offer assistance. Well, somehow Poe was coherent enough to give him the name of a magazine editor, Joseph Snodgrass. So Walker immediately wrote a note to Snodgrass, sent it right away. We actually have a copy of that note. This is what it said. Baltimore City, October 3rd, 1849. Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Joseph W. Walker, to Dr. J.E. Snodgrass. And to the everlasting credit of Mr. Joseph Snodgrass, he came immediately and had Poe admitted to the Washington University Hospital. There Poe would live out the last 4 days of his life under the care of the attending physician, Dr. John J. Moran. It's hard to decipher what exactly transpired during those final 4 days of Poe's life, because Dr. Moran would spend his later years lecturing about the care he took of the famous Edgar Allan Poe by concocting ever more lurid and fabulous tales about what occurred during those 4 days. So deciphering what exactly happened is a little difficult, but it seems that Poe never regained enough lucidity to describe what had happened to him during the time he had gone missing. He spent his last days haunted by frightening hallucinations, incoherent except for a name that he called out repeatedly. Reynolds. Reynolds. To this day, no one has any idea who this Reynolds is that Poe was calling for. When Poe actually did die on Sunday, October 7th at 5 a.m., his last words were, quote, "Lord, help my poor soul," end quote. And with that, we have one of the most curious cases of life imitating art in history. A man who is the acknowledged master of the macabre, a pioneer of detective fiction, left us a very macabre mystery indeed. The mystery of what happened to him before he died and what exactly he died of. And so today on the History of Being Human podcast, we cover the story of the strange death of Edgar Allan Poe. Although today Poe is acknowledged as one of the great masters of American letters, his life was anything but a series of triumphs. He did not get to enjoy those accolades much during his own lifetime. You might say that Poe's life was one of tragedy, misfortune, and disappointment. As is often the case, much of the trouble in Poe's life was seemingly inflicted on him by the hand of fate, by illnesses, poverty, circumstances well beyond his control. But we also have to admit that much of Poe's suffering and anguish was self-inflicted. Well, maybe that's too harsh. Let us just say instead that Poe did not always make the choices best calculated to alleviate suffering in his own life. With that properly mealy-mouthed and non-controversial statement, let's learn a little bit about Poe's biography, because it does play into how he died and how people explain his death. Poe was born Edgar Poe. People naturally assume that Edgar Allen Poe, the Allen part, was a middle name given to him at birth, but it wasn't. No, when he was born in 1809, his parents, David and Elizabeth Poe, two itinerant actors, just named him Edgar Poe. David, the father, was actually the son of a decorated, well-respected, semi-famous Revolutionary War general, but David, Edgar's father, did not take to soldiering. In fact, there were two things he loved in life. And spoiler alert, neither of those two things he loved in life were taking care of his wife and children. No, he loved acting on stage and consuming massive amounts of alcohol. By the time Edgar was 18 months old, his father had abandoned the family, abandoned Elizabeth and Edgar and the other children in the family, because Edgar had an older brother who became a sailor later in life, and a younger sister who became a poet later in life. So the father abandoned the family when Edgar was about 18 months old. But the tragedy didn't stop there. Edgar's mother died of consumption, which means tuberculosis, just a few months before Edgar's 3rd birthday. Coincidentally, his father, who was not living with the family and unbeknownst to the family, seems to have died within 3 days of Edgar's mother's death. So both of his parents passed away just before he was 3 years of age. Some of the sting of this tragedy for Edgar was averted when he was taken into the home of a wealthy Richmond merchant. And this is where the name Allen came from, because the wealthy merchant into whose home Poe was taken as a foster child, though never formally adopted, was John Allen. So Edgar Allen Poe became his name from then on. He was raised by the Allen family in Richmond, Virginia. John Allen, his foster father, was not poverty-stricken, and he wasn't a drunk, but he was miserly and emotionally very distant. So Poe never had a close relationship with his foster father, and it became outright hostile later on. But Frances Allen, his foster mother, was much more affectionate, and Poe was actually very close to his foster mother. In fact, Poe would write sometime later, "She, I believe, loved me as if I were her own child." But even that connection would end in tragedy. In 1815, when Edgar was 6 years old, the family moved to England to spend 5 years. There he attended various boarding schools, and from all accounts, he excelled both academically and, what might be a little more surprising, athletically. But it was also during this stay in England that it's thought that his foster mother, Frances, the one that he was so close to, contracted tuberculosis. In 1829, when she was just 35 years old, Edgar had just turned 20 years old, he would lose his second mother to tuberculosis. And of course, as is the nature of tuberculosis, she would be ill for years before finally succumbing to it. But we need to rewind about 3 years before his foster mother's death to the time that Poe enrolled in the University of Virginia, because that was a fairly formative event in his life. The University of Virginia was a very new school at the time Poe enrolled in it. When Poe began his studies in ancient and modern languages there, he was only 17 years old, so still just a boy. And as a student, Poe excelled. He was brilliant, by all accounts. But what he did not excel at was gambling and drinking, two habits which he took up during his time at the University of Virginia. Now, depending on who you ask, Poe was not given enough money to survive by his foster father, John Allen. So in a well-intentioned but foolhardy attempt to pay off his debts, to buy food, books, etc., he took up gambling. And as a result, his debts multiplied. So he wrote to his foster father, John Allen, asking for more money, which initially John Allen obliged. But of course, over time, Edgar Allan Poe's debts just kept multiplying. By all accounts, by the age of 17, Poe was a gambling addict. He was also addicted to alcohol by the age of 17. That's when he took up what would become a lifelong habit of alcohol abuse. Poe had a very pathological relationship with alcohol. It made him miserable, he couldn't handle it at all, and yet he couldn't stop drinking it. This is how one of his classmates described his drinking. Quote, "He would always seize the tempting glass, generally unmixed with sugar or water, in fact, perfectly straight, and without the least apparent pleasure, swallow the contents, never pausing until the last drop had passed his lips. One glass at a time was all that he could take, but this was sufficient to rouse his whole nervous nature into a state of strongest excitement, which found vent in a continuous flow of wild, fascinating talk that irresistibly enchanted every listener with his siren-like power." End quote. When John Allen, Poe's foster father, heard about his drinking and gambling, he was furious. He withdrew all financial support. Poe had no choice but to drop out of the university. At that time, he was only 18 years old, but he did not feel welcome returning to the Allen home in Richmond. So he wandered around in Boston, took some odd jobs, realized he was not going to be able to sustain himself, and joined the army. Here again, Poe seems to have excelled. He was promoted to the rank of sergeant major within 2 years. So he shot up through the enlisted ranks to the highest rank you could have as an enlisted soldier within 2 years. Poe had tremendous natural abilities, if he didn't also have so many self-defeating behaviors. It was also during this time that his mother's condition worsened, and she ended up dying. In another sad story, Poe missed the funeral of his foster mother, Frances Allen, by about 4 days. So, without going into every detail of his life, you get an idea of what a tragic existence Edgar Allan Poe had. And as we said, so much of his suffering was self-inflicted. Admitted to the University of Virginia, drinks and gambles himself out of that. He makes his way into the army, shoots up through the ranks, can't stand the discipline, his mind is too restless, and he drops out after 2 years. He succeeds in getting admitted to West Point Academy to become an officer in the military. He doesn't last there more than 1 year, drops out. He takes a job in Baltimore as an editor. It allows him to develop his literary skills, but he loses that job after 1 year because of heavy drinking. No one doubts his gifts and his skills as a writer. They're becoming apparent by the time he's a very young man. And yet, he has to move from one place to another, from town to town, from job to job, because he loses so many different jobs. He takes up a lifestyle similar to his itinerant actor parents, his biological parents, moving from Richmond, Virginia, to Boston, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New York, working, writing, publishing, sometimes writing pieces that become semi-famous, but never making much money, certainly not making enough money to settle down in any kind of comfort. Even though he achieved some fame, he struggled against poverty his entire life. In fact, his most famous work, one which became a classic of world poetry, The Raven, fetched him $15. Much of the tragedy in Poe's life, though, was not self-inflicted. We already talked about the fact that tuberculosis took both of his biological parents and then his foster mother. But the ravages of TB in Poe's life wouldn't stop there. In fact, the one bright spot for Poe during much of his life, which, of course, since it's Poe, also happens to be very weird, while Poe was living in Baltimore, drinking himself out of another editing job, he fell in love with his 13-year-old first cousin, Virginia Clem. They were married when he was 27 and she was 13. So this marriage to us is strange and frankly offensive in a couple of ways. One is she was his first cousin. In those days, that wasn't all that unusual. What was unusual, though, was the fact that Virginia Clem was 13 when she married Edgar Allan Poe. He was 27. And you can throw out all the arguments about presentism you want. That was not normal in those days, just like it's not normal now. But whatever the case may be, this was one of the greatest joys of his life. He loved Virginia. He treated her with respect and kindness. She believed in him, she supported him, and was truly in love with him. Despite the age difference, it was, by all accounts, a very successful marriage. But as you probably already know, tragedy would strike again. She herself would contract tuberculosis 7 years after they were married. And then, over the next 5 years, she would weaken, her health would worsen until she passed away. Poe spent many long hours, days and nights, at Virginia's bedside, all in a vain effort to nurse her back to health. Tuberculosis would become the model for the disease in one of his most famous short stories, The Mask of the Red Death. In that he writes, quote, "The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men." End quote. Poe himself would only outlive his 25-year-old wife by 2.5 years, and you can't read many of his works and see all of the deaths of beautiful women contained therein without realizing how much these deaths of first his biological mother, then his foster mother, and then his beloved wife deeply affected him. In his own letters, Poe says that he was devastated by the loss of Virginia. But the idea that he just gave up, that he gave up on life, seems to be completely incorrect. In fact, Poe kept on writing and editing, and even got back into the courting game after his wife's death. Despite all the loss, all the frustration, all the drinking, all the drugs, Poe does not seem to have been suicidal. As evidence of that, I'll refer to a study in 2020 in a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Affective Disorders, a study titled "Deep into That Darkness Peering, a computational analysis of the role of depression in Edgar Allan Poe's life and death." The results of that study are somewhat surprising, and I will simply quote them. Quote, "Significant, consistent patterns of depression were not found and do not support suicide as a cause of death. However, linguistic evidence was found suggesting the presence of several potential depressive episodes over the course of Poe's life. These episodes were the most pronounced during years of Poe's greatest success, as well as those following the death of his late wife." End quote. So, potential depressive episodes, no evidence whatsoever of suicidal ideation. And so with that very short review of the life of Edgar Allan Poe, let's get back to his death. As we said, September 27, 1849, Poe boards a train in Richmond, Virginia, disappears until the 3rd of October, where he's found delirious outside a tavern in Baltimore, a tavern that was, yes, a drinking establishment, but also serving as a voting place. He's found by Joseph Walker, who dashes off a letter to Joseph Snodgrass, who takes him to Washington University Hospital, where Poe dies a few days later, repeating the name Reynolds during his last few days of life. A little more detail from Snodgrass is in order. This is how he describes Poe. Quote, "He was repulsive with unkempt hair, a haggard, unwashed face, and lusterless and vacant eyes." End quote. Snodgrass described his clothing as a dirty shirt with no vest, unpolished shoes, well worn, and didn't seem to fit Poe. So Poe was apparently in somebody else's clothes. This is how the physician at Washington University Hospital described his clothes. According to John Joseph Moran, quote, "A stained, faded, old bombazine coat, pantaloons of a similar character, a pair of worn-out shoes run down at the heels, and an old straw hat." End quote. None of these things was Poe ever known to have worn during his lifetime. And one more piece of information. Poe had a trunk of belongings with him, but that trunk was found left behind at the Swan Tavern in Richmond. Poe's belongings were left at the same town he boarded the train in at a drinking establishment. All the medical records and all documents relating to Poe's death, including Poe's death certificate, have been lost if they ever existed. So the precise cause of Poe's death is disputed. And just as in the case of Alexander the Great or Friedrich Nietzsche, there are no shortage of theories. Medical journals, I wouldn't say are full of hypotheses about his death, but every few years another one comes out. Let's start with one of the newer theories, that is death by brain tumor. This is a very recent theory. It is said that when Poe's body was dug up to transport to a better grave, so initially he's buried in a very modest grave, almost unmarked, but in 1875, his remains were moved to a more prominent position with a better tombstone, as was befitting the famous man of letters. So this is almost 3 decades after Poe had died. Of course, there wasn't much left to him except skeleton. One of the workers moving his body, though, noticed that inside his skull, there was a clump of something hard rolling around. That's how he described it. Sorry for the graphic detail, but inside the skull of Poe was a clump of something hard rolling around. At the time of this discovery, the newspaper said, well, this was just Poe's brain. It had shriveled up, dried up, and it was rolling around inside of his skull. Well, this didn't make sense to the American author Matthew Pearl, who was writing a story about Poe. He actually contacted a forensic pathologist and asked about this clump inside Poe's head. The pathologist told him, well, that couldn't be his brain. The brain is one of the first things to desiccate and doesn't roll around in a hard little clump inside the skull after death. Instead, according to the pathologist, it's possible this was a calcified brain tumor. Brain tumors can become calcified when they can no longer regulate the flow of calcium in and out of their cells. A calcified mass or a hard clump of material inside Poe's skull could indicate that he had an aggressive brain tumor at the time that he died. And so from the author Matthew Pearl, we have one possible explanation for Poe's death. Another theory also comes from the world of neurology. That is, Poe might have been suffering from several complex partial seizures around the time of his death. Poe might have had epilepsy compounded by his drinking. Think of the way he was found, lolling about in the gutter, completely confused and disoriented. All of this is consistent with the ictal and post-ictal state of a seizure disorder. Whether or not Poe had a seizure disorder, there's also speculation that alcohol-related or withdrawal-related seizures played a role in the condition he was found in. So seizures have to go into the list of potential causes of Poe's death. Next, we have the physical trauma of a severe beating. It is said by the biographer E. O. Smith that, quote, at the instigation of a woman who considered herself injured by him, Poe was cruelly beaten, blow upon blow, by a ruffian who knew of no better mode of avenging suspected injuries. It is well known that a brain fever followed, end quote. I don't know where this biographer got this tale. I have not been able to find a backup reference for this anywhere. So I don't know how likely it is that Poe was beaten to death. In fact, it doesn't seem that Dr. Moran described serious bodily injuries in the form of broken bones, deep bruises, contusions, etc. So I don't know about the ruffian beating Poe nearly to death or to death because he had offended a lady. That seems very unlikely to me. But there is another angle to this beating story. In an article in 1872 called The Grave of Poe, written by the author Eugene Didier, he says, quote, while in Baltimore, Poe ran into friends from West Point, who he joined for drinks. He got madly drunk off a single glass of champagne and began to wander the streets. In his drunken state, he was robbed and beaten by ruffians and left insensible in the street all night, end quote. So here we have another article, this time again probably based on nothing more than rumor, that Poe was beaten senseless before he passed away. And we have to say, it's possible. We can't prove he wasn't beaten senseless. I just don't have any information from the people who originally found and then treated Poe that he was beaten up in that kind of way. So I can't prove the negative. I can't prove it didn't happen. It just doesn't seem very likely without more evidence. Let's move now to the elephant in the room, that is death by drinking. It is no hidden fact. In fact, it's very well known that Poe abused alcohol and various other intoxicants and stimulants throughout his life. He became a belligerent, loudmouth drunk after partaking of just one drink. Probably a family trait, because according to many sources, his sister, the one we mentioned earlier, his biological sister, had the exact same problem. Joseph Snodgrass, the editor who took Poe to the hospital, thought that Poe had drunk himself to death. He didn't come up with a seizure disorder or a brain tumor. He knew Poe. He simply thought he had drunk himself to death. Pretty simple. So it would not be all that surprising if Poe with a long-duration substance use disorder passed away from complications related to that disorder. But I will say that there is one wrench in this works, one major flaw in this otherwise tidy picture, and that is that after Poe passed away, post-mortem lead analysis was carried out on his remains. Lead was often added to wine, so theoretically, if Poe had been drinking heavily around the time of his death, he would have had high levels of lead in his system. That is the opposite of what the case seems to have been. According to the curator of the Poe House Museum, the lead levels in Edgar Allan Poe's post-mortem analysis were quite low. That might indicate that Poe had avoided alcohol in the months or years leading up to his death. And it is certainly an intriguing finding. But I will say this, wine is only one form of alcohol, and it seems that not all the wine, even in Poe's day, had high levels of lead. So I do not believe personally that post-mortem analysis completely rules out acute alcohol intoxication as the cause of Poe's death, or at least a major contributor. I'm going to mention this one, but I'm not happy about it. According to Dr. R. Michael Benitez, Poe might have died of rabies. The fact that he was hallucinating, sweating, and shouting the name Reynolds are all consistent with a diagnosis of rabies. And what is even more telling to Dr. Benitez, Poe did not drink water during his hospitalization. A clear case of hydrophobia. I don't really know what to say about that. I mean, there you have it, QED. Didn't drink water, hallucinating, he had a fever. So apparently he boarded a train, got bitten by a zombie or some kind of rabid raccoon or something else, contracted rabies, disappeared for 5 days, turned up in a gutter in somebody else's clothes, calling out the name Reynolds. Again, all behaviors clearly associated with a diagnosis of rabies. Just like the movie Old Yeller. When Old Yeller has rabies, Travis knows it because Old Yeller is wandering around the yard in Pa's hat and Ma's apron, calling out the name Reynolds. So I'm just going to let that one stand on its own merits and move on. I'm just going to move on to the last theory that I want to cover. I think it's the most likely. I think it checks the most boxes. It seems to explain why Poe was where he was on the day he was, in the clothing he was. I mean, let's face it, that's one of the strangest things of all. I'm speaking of the theory that Poe died by voter fraud, what is called cooping. In the 19th century, corrupt politicians would pay gangs to force people to vote for them. This could take various forms. At times, what they would do is they would practically kidnap a victim, ply them with liquor, of course, dress them up in many different outfits, give them different names, and force them to go vote many different times for their candidate. If these victims became a little stubborn, resistant, let's say, they would force liquor down their throat or beat them. This could also work a little better if the election workers were bribed, if the judges were bribed, ballots were stolen, etc. This kind of thing was actually very common in Baltimore around this time. Why was Poe found outside a polling place? Why was he wearing someone else's clothes? Why was he apparently drunk or severely intoxicated, even when there are many historians who claim he had given up drinking sometime before this? Why are there reports of him having been beaten, even though this isn't corroborated clearly by medical evidence? And why was he calling out the name Reynolds? Now, this is purely speculative, but is it possible that he was given the name Reynolds as one of his pseudonyms to vote for, and that in his very confused state, he called out that name, thinking that's what he was supposed to do, that's what was expected of him? Again, purely speculative, but at least all of these factors can be possibly explained by the cooping theory. That's why, in my mind, it was the premier theory at the time of his death, and it remains the best explanation for what happened to Edgar Allan Poe. This has been the History of Being Human podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Let me know what you think. Weigh in on this if you want to. Send me an email at thobhpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you to those of you who have liked and subscribed to the program. Thank you to those of you who just listen. Appreciate your support, and we'll be back shortly with another episode.